Hey there, brothers and sisters. Thanks for listening to the Mormon News Roundup. And if you are enjoying this show, please consider making a donation. Patreon makes an important contribution to helping us ruminate on the great and spacious beehive here. So thanks so much to everyone for supporting us on patreon.com.
Ladies and gentlemen, kicking off the first stop on his world tour, our new president and prophet, Russell M. Nelson. You say you want some revelation, well, here you go. It's gonna blow your freaking mind.
Greetings, brothers and sisters. Welcome to the weekly Mormon News Roundup, where Al, John Hamer, and D. Bays are going to ruminate on the great and spacious beehive. This week is March 12th of 2023, episode 50. Our 50th episode. This is a big one. So welcome to John Hamer. He's co-hosting with us this week. Let's see, we have some really interesting news this week. From the Community of Christ, President Veazy is going to step down. The LDS missionary slang is also in the hot seat, and why paying tithing isn't just for Mormons. So this is a juicy week. We're glad to have D-Bays and John. And now, am I pronouncing your name right, John Hamer?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very honored to be here on your 50th episode.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, it's great to have you. If you want to get in touch with us, we're at MormonNewsRoundup.org, or you can send us an email to kolob@MormonNewsRoundup.org. That's KOLOB. Now, John, who are you, and what is your religious background?
I am the pastor of the Community of Christ Toronto congregation, and also of our Beyond the Walls global kind of online ministry, which is the church's largest online ministry. Community of Christ, people will know maybe in the Utah Church as the former Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or RLDS Church. I serve in the priesthood calling of 70 in that denomination. In terms of background, I was born and raised in the Utah tradition as a mission field Mormon. I grew up in Minnesota, but ultimately left the church as a teenager over the issues of priesthood ordination for women, and sexism in the church, and that sort of thing. And was mostly an unchurched person for most of my adult life until joining Community of Christ as a 40-year-old.
Wow, this is quite the story you've got. So you converted to the Community of Christ in your 40s.
Well, just barely 40, yes.
Okay, when you were just barely 40.
April 6th, 2010, which is 4 days after my birthday.
Okay. Wow, that's a very, very special date as well that you picked as well. You really make the rounds, John, on the Community of Christ Mormon YouTube podcasting circuit. What draws you to the space?
Well, so I have a lot of background in history, and also as a teacher and a communicator. And when one is doing, let's say, academic research, and if you want to publish an article in one of the wonderful Mormon history or Mormon culture journals that we have, like Dialogue and the Journal of Mormon Studies, Mormon Historic Sites, the John Whitmer Historical Association, the reality is that you are really going to reach an audience of a few hundred people, maybe a few thousand if we're being generous with how many people are going to read the article. Whereas the reality, if we are communicating through media like podcasts, through YouTube and so forth, we're able to get ideas spread more broadly. My top lecture videos that I've given on YouTube have over 400,000 views. And so that obviously is reaching a lot more people than I could through just, let's say, a narrow academic frame.
Yeah, for sure.
Yep. Now, it seems like your expertise is in map making and the so-called succession crisis. Is that right? How did you gain that expertise? Do I have that right?
Well, those are some of my fields, yes. So in terms of map making, there's a couple things. So I did actually study as a graduate student medieval European history with a focus on medieval and ancient map making and things like that. So I'm actually there's very few experts on this in the world, so it's a very small field. So but I'm one of the more, I'd say, dozen or 24 people who knows a lot about that particular topic. But also at the same time, as computer-aided desktop publishing was being created it was started when I was a teenager in high school on my high school newspaper. I've always been interested in publishing, and I went down that kind of career path, and I pioneered some of the map making for academic presses, and so I have maps that have been published with the Smithsonian, with the Oxford University Press and Columbia, and a bunch of other university presses, the Joseph Smith Papers Project, and so forth. So that became, how did I do that? I just was interested in maps. I love maps from an early age, and I was there at a very early time, and so I've been doing that for a long time. In terms of the succession crisis, this is just something that's always intrigued me, and so I have always been very interested in all of the smaller Latter-day Saint tradition churches, and so how do I generate expertise by reading, all of the books of the New Mormon history, and then ultimately talking to lots and lots of individuals and reading, books in some of the different traditions, the all manner of ites, as we sometimes say.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I run a YouTube channel, John, that's called Mormon Movie Reviews, and we have 85 episodes. I just reviewed a film that's called In Emma's Footsteps, which traces Emma's life from the martyrdom until the end of her life. Unfortunately, it was blocked on YouTube, and I have to redo it so it doesn't have as many moving images. But have you ever seen that film, In Emma's Footsteps? It's put together by the Joseph Smith and Emma Hale Smith Historical Society. Have you ever caught that one?
I have not watched it, so
well,
I don't know.
Once I get that review, I'll send it to you, and you can take a look at it, because I think that would be right in your wheelhouse. It's a very interesting film, especially since it's from a Brighamite branch-focused look at Emma. It's very interesting what it is that they covered and things that they didn't cover. Now, is there anything else about your personal life or religious beliefs that you would like to share with us before we get started?
So I guess the main thing is that I do have kind of a unique placement within the movement, because I'm someone who's very committed to the Latter-day Saint tradition, and I'm obviously involved also religiously, although the experience of Community of Christ as a progressive church is so different from the Utah LDS tradition in terms of, let's say, focus on literalism and things like that, that it's that being really committed to religion is a fairly different space than with not as much overlap. So I don't know. It's hard to describe it all in a shorthand or a thumbnail, but I guess I'll throw that out there.
Okay. Yeah. Well said. So I have one quick question before we get into the news here. So John, why the Community of Christ? What is it that drew you to them?
Well, in fact, like I say, I had not been interested or involved in any religion. I had just kind of gone off into academics and was focused on that sort of a thing. And it was really only in doing my own kind of family history and family heritage, and actually learning about ancestors who both were, joined the movement back in 1832 and so forth. In other words, where my personal family story is also the Latter-day Saint history story. And then the kind of the connections and things that had been edited out as far as I'd never been told. So all of the connections that my ancestors had with the Whitmerites, or becoming Whitmerites, and becoming like one of the members of the family when it split apart in 1844, went off and became a Rigdonite apostle and so forth. I didn't know anything like that kind of thing growing up. Anyway, I went off and exploring all of that, and in the course of doing that, I fairly quickly came into contact with members of the Latter-day Saint historians community who are from Community of Christ. And largely, as they were telling me about their church and where it had gone and all of the changes it had made, and well, you don't have to believe this way to be part of this church, and that kind of thing. All of my assumptions about what a church was, weren't borne out by what they were saying. And over time, I started to believe them. I started to look at it and see how it was actually lived. And when I really, began to experience it from that perspective, I became a serious investigator myself, and I kind of looked back into my past. I realized as a kid growing up Mormon, I'd read the Book of Mormon multiple times and things like that with my family and on my own and so forth, but I hadn't ever even read straight through. I mean, I read a bunch of the Old Testament, but I never read straight through even one of the Gospels, And so I said, look, if I'm going to be serious about this, I mean, I love the community, I love what it stands for and things like that, but if I'm going to be involved, I'm going to have to, find out what Christianity is all about. What does this really mean? And so I picked up, I think, I'm named John. I'll read the Gospel of John. There's 4 of them. That sounds like a good one to start with. And I was pretty fed up with it right from the start, right out of the gate, because it is. I had a background as a historian of reading narrative historically, and the Gospel of John, it more or less has nothing in it is historical. Nothing in it describes how the historical Jesus would have been. It is written in a later era by Christians who are writing from a perspective of their understanding, their theological understanding of a God Jesus and how he would have acted from their perspective. And so, like I say, when I first started with this thing, I was like, I took it, I literally threw it on the floor and said, this kind of thing. And it was only after, lots more study, and many more years of thought, and reflection and spiritual practice prayer, that caused me to say, look, I'm feeling called to be a part of this community.
All right. Yeah, well said. This is a real treat for us, especially for our 50th episode, because very early on we had to define that Mormonism really encapsulates anybody who follows the teachings that originated with Joseph Smith. And so to have a perspective from the community of Christ, kind of a sister church to the Brighamite sect, this is a real honor to have you with us. You're very welcome here, John.
Well, thank you so very much.
And let's see how welcome you really are by giving us a Mormon News Roundup joke of the week. Let's not put the cart before the horse, because the jury is still out. So I understand, John, that you do have the Mormon joke of the week for us.
Okay, well, we'll see if you guys like this or not. I'm not much of a joke teller, so and whether or not you think this is a joke. So a Mormon joke, to me anyway, that is central to my life experience is that liberal Mormons often tell me, hey, I want a church with women's ordination, with LGBT acceptance, where Latter-day Saints aren't correlated, where being non-creedal means you can explore your beliefs without the threat of discipline, where you can read the Book of Mormon as an allegory. I want a church that's more honest about Joseph Smith and our history and more focused on helping others than obeying leaders. And I say to them, okay, check. Okay, I got all that for you. And the joke is, I guess, oh, just kidding. We don't really want all that. We just wanted to complain.
That is very true.
Well done, John.
That is so true. That is so true. That is very, very funny stuff. Good stuff. Okay, glad to have you on here, John. Now, our first news article here is Community of Christ, a prophet president to retire. State President Stephen M. Veazy announced Monday, March 6th, that he plans to retire effective with a scheduled world conference in early June 2025. He has served as the prophet president of the Community of Christ since June of 2005, and he's turning 66 soon. So, hey, can you walk us through what's happening with the news here with President Veazy, John?
Yeah, absolutely. So President Veazy, as you say, is the prophet president of the church and has been so, now you say for 2 decades. And it is very normal at this point in and expected in Community of Christ practice that the prophet president will serve a term, which is not, it's an open-ended term at present, but that at a certain point, when they feel like they're getting on in age, or when they've made their contribution, then they feel that God is calling someone else to be, the prophet and president of the church, that they will announce a schedule for their retirement. That has been occurring since the 70s. So previously, the presidents have lived until they died, and it's rather than step down. But in the 70s, President W. Wallace Smith, who was in fact just one of the grandsons of Joseph Smith, Jr., announced that he was going to step down. His son, Wallace B. Smith, became president designate at that time, and there was a couple-year process where that overlapped. Then W. Wallace Smith retired and became the prophet emeritus of the church, which was a position that he held until his death. His son, who then became the prophet and president of the church, Wallace B. Smith, he continued to have that until his retirement. He named as his successor W. Grant McMurray. He continues to be Wallace B. Smith is alive to this day, and he continues to be the prophet emeritus of the church. Grant McMurray left the church presidency, and in, like you say, early 2000s, and Steve Veazy, who's been president and prophet since then.
Now, it seems like President Veazy is really seems to me that he's beloved both within and without the faith. And he released a personal statement that went along with this. I'd like to highlight and discuss a few aspects of this particular statement. Yeah. And Al, do you have that first section of President Veazy's statement about his retiring?
Yeah, where it says, "I believe."
Uh-huh.
Okay, yeah. He says, "I believe my decision to retire is timely for me and my family."
I find this to be very interesting phrasing, because it makes it sound like this is a very personal decision. And I find it remarkable that he does not trot out the capital R revelation word, which it seems like that comes out of Salt Lake a lot. He doesn't say that it was a revelation. He just says that it's a personal. It seems like he makes it to be a personal decision.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
I really like that, personally. He takes this attitude of, well, I can make my own decisions for myself. I don't need to, have an act of Congress, or rather an act of God, to make a decision like this. I think it's very appropriate and very mature. I'm really impressed with this.
So our understanding in Community of Christ of the role of prophet, and also in Scripture too, is that God doesn't actually speak with human words. That rather, God's inspiration is open to us all. And when we have a prophet, an evangelist, whoever is composing revelation, that the human person, they're writing human words in response to the divine, right? And so there is no dictaphone where God is picking up the phone and the prophet in Salt Lake or in Independence, Missouri, or the Pope in Rome is getting, word for word what God is saying. And so the prophets of the church who have the calling of bringing inspired counsel or revelation to the church for consideration by the World Conference, they have been pretty open the last couple decades in how that discernment process works, how they wrestle over words, how they it doesn't just how things kind of slowly take place in their mind and so forth before they present it to us. And so that is a discernment that we're all called to do in the church, as recent sections of the Doctrine and Covenants talk about us becoming a prophetic people. So for us, we say continuing revelation is one of the enduring principles of the restored gospel that we're all supposed to participate in.
Well, thanks a lot, John. Now, do you have that next section for us, Al, from this statement?
So will create opportunities for younger world church leaders to share their gifts more extensively, which will bless the church.
Now, I do find that interesting because, with the secularization of the United States, the rise of the so-called religious nuns, young persons in particular crave youthful leadership. That's one reason that, for instance, Nancy Pelosi stepped down as Speaker of the House after 20 years is because she really realized that she's a little bit too old. And it seems like he is emphasizing that youth perspective, which I think has a broad appeal.
Well, and I think that it also I think proves dynamically in institutions to have a major effect. Because I do think that one of the reasons why the two churches in the 1960s, when both churches were presented with the evidence, for example, of the New Mormon history and all these sorts of things, that each church kind of took completely different courses, right? And so the LDS church kind of decided, well, deny, let's not, not listen to what all of the evidence is saying. Let's double down on narrative and this kind of thing. Whereas our LDS leaders largely said, well, we're going to listen to, what, the experts are telling us and just understand our faith within reality, right? And so as a result of that, which has been a hard row to hoe, but on the other hand, I think it's in part because the leaders were so much, a whole generation or two younger in Community of Christ in the 1960s than even LDS leaders were at the time because of the LDS succession process. So the way the seniority process works in the senior leadership, two leadership forums in the LDS Church as opposed to Community of Christ.
I guess that's to say that the RLDS had a younger, more adaptable clergy leading them, whereas the LDS sect was a bunch of old curmudgeons who were too set in their ways to change. Huh?
Well, I mean, that would be the shorthand, right? I mean, I think in terms of why that maybe happened. So the RLDS Church from the very beginning has maintained the original church's difference. The First Presidency is not just an extension of the council or quorum of 12. Those are totally different councils. And from the beginning, the RLDS apostles have always retired. So in other words, it's a job that you have or a calling that you have in a lot of cases fairly young, but into kind of like a regular retirement age usually, and that's been kind of a tradition since the 1860s. And like I say, there has been since the 70s anyway the same precedent for the president and prophet of the church as well. I think for all but just a handful of years in the 19-teens, the LDS prophet has always been older than the RLDS prophet. And this is one time when Joseph F. Smith was president of the Utah Church, and his cousin Joseph III was president of the RLDS Church, and he'd been president for 50 years, and so suddenly he really was old, But in general, it's usually, I mean, somewhere in the range of 40 years younger, in terms of the presidency.
Sure. Yeah. Hey, so Al, can you read that one last section from President Veazy's statement here? I just want to discuss that, and we'll wrap this particular article up.
Certainly. It says, announcing my retirement at this time will facilitate an orderly leadership transition.
Right. So announcing a retirement in this fashion means there's no church leadership vacuum. It means that you don't have to put up with geriatric and mentally incapacitated leadership for years and years on end. And it also means that members can take an active part in the governance of the faith. Now, if you read the statement itself, President Veazy has a 4-phase transition plan, which is supposed to ensure a smooth leadership transition. And I have to tell you, John, that I'm quite jealous of that. I mean, it seriously sounds very inspired to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're still engaging in it, right? So this just barely happened. So we have not had one fixed way for succession in Community of Christ, and so in general, each of the different presidents they're the prophet, and so they also bring new stuff, right? It doesn't only go back to Joseph Smith. There are continually added new sections of our Doctrine and Covenants as prophets bring inspired counsel to the World Conference. The World Conference can canonize it, and so on and so forth. And so actually, there's always changes. And so this is ever since the 70s, like I say, there's been these orderly transitions where there's an announcement made that there's going to be a retirement, and we give some time to adjust and so forth.
Yeah, this is really inspiring. Inspiring is a great word for it. That these prophets, as a living, breathing voice or mouthpiece for the Lord, each of them gets their own revelation about how the transition will be from them to the next. So I really like that. And I got to say, I don't know where else to put this in this here, but I do want to say it seems really noteworthy that President Veazy is younger than anybody in the Quorum of 12 Apostles in the LDS Church out of Salt Lake. So
right, I mean,
for him to say, okay, it's time for me to retire, that's really striking.
Yeah, I mean, David Bednar was one of the youngest ordained apostles in the LDS tradition, and he was, I believe, 16. I don't know the exact date on that, but he was one of the youngest. But we usually don't. Yeah. President Veazy was the prophet of president when he was 45 years old. We don't even get apostles when you're 45, much less the president of the church.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it takes 40 years on average. It took Russell M. Nelson, I believe, 39 years to attain to the head. It takes 40 years on average just to get to the head of it. And if you don't ordain people until they're in their late 40s, at a minimum, maybe 50s, you can see that the age here that we're talking about is very, very old. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right.
Just one other thing, John. When I read about the statement, this is the last thing on the statement. He talks a lot about discernment, and I get the impression that in the Community of Christ, the concept of discernment is different from the Mormon one. Is that just me reading into it, or?
Well, it definitely. So you'd have to tell me what the definition. My presumption of the Mormon one is that discernment means obeying leaders. I don't know. I don't know what you have to tell me what it is.
Oh well, maybe that was a bad question. A discernment in the LDS tradition is kind of like I don't know, that your bishop has discernment, so he knows what's best for you. It's kind of like he has the ability to give you a calling, or your stake president. He prays about you and realizes that you lost your job, but you never told anybody, so he has discernment, so he knows to come and check on you. That's kind of like what discernment is in the LDS tradition.
Yeah, almost like intuition.
Yeah, like an intuition.
Yeah, so no, wouldn't be intuition. So discernment in Community of Christ, would be like the process, like that Joseph Smith is trying to explain to Oliver Cowdery about how to dictate Book of Mormon text or whatever. Studying it out in your mind. You're going to be pondering things. You're going to pray about things. You have a spiritual practice. You are. You have dialogue with others. You should be reading and studying. So, these are the ways that we are kind of contemplating path forward kinds of things. And discernment is part of a community-based, let's say, revelatory process that we kind of engage in at every level. So my congregation went through what we called a discernment process when we were, we had decided we had to sell our old building that we'd been in for 80 years that was oversized and had all these problems, and what was the path ahead? We were asking, how is God calling us to be a community of Christ in downtown Toronto in the 21st century? And so we engaged in workshops, where we asked our members what matters most individually, and we shared ideas and so forth. It was a year-long process that resulted in a plan going forward, and so forth.
Okay, very well. Well, thank you very much for covering this concept about President Veazy. We'll be looking forward to seeing what's going to happen there in the World Conference, which we're going to get to in just a moment. But before we do, we have a Mormon News Roundup poll of the week, which goes along with this. And if you come on over to Anchor or Spotify, you can interact with us on our poll of the week. And Al, what is the Mormon News Roundup poll of the week for episode 50?
Yeah. Okay. So the poll this week is, why doesn't the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have a better prophetic leadership transition process?
That is a good question. And John, we're going to give you a couple of options here. We want you to be the first person to take our poll, which, by the way, do not take this poll too seriously. But let's give you a couple of options here, and let's see, why don't you think that your sister religion has a better prophetic transition process? Is it number one?
Because Brigham Young's uber-inspired transition process based on apostolic ordination date has been working so well.
Yeah, I mean, that could be. Maybe that's the reason, Al. I don't know. I'm not too sure. I don't know. I'm not too sure about that. I don't know how well that is working, actually, now that you mention it. Or, but I don't want to poison the well. It could be. You can always.
Okay, there could be another. There's more options, right?
Yeah, number two.
Because Mormons never had anyone as handsome as Joseph Smith III at the helm.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot to say for that. I seriously think if you lined up all of the prophets for FLDS, LDS, RLDS, you line up all the prophets, Joseph Smith III, he's going to come out on top on that one. I think that is without question.
He was quite dashing.
And by the way, he had this sporting this, in post Civil War era in the United States, all the guys, all the veterans there, he wasn't a veteran, but anyway, all these guys, the style was for these crazy beards, right? And that has now finally come back around in style. So Joseph III is just such a styling stuff.
That's right.
Absolutely. Or is it number three? How about your third choice there?
Bottom line, Orson Hyde was a wicked and a slothful servant.
Yeah, that's the reason. If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in right now.
True.
It all seriously goes back down to him. If he hadn't been a wicked and a slothful servant, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in right now, honestly. Seriously.
Yes.
Or is it maybe it's number four?
Because white, zany, dementia-stricken geriatrics are unpredictable and fun.
They are unpredictable. That's true.
You never know what's going to happen next. Are we no longer going to be Mormons anymore? We're going to now call it the Tabernacle Choir of Temple Square or something. It's because we can't say the word Mormon.
Right. So it does add a level of unpredictability and a lot of. It's very zany. But I'm not sure if it's great for a good leadership. We'll just put it that way. Or how about number five?
Because cisgender Utah-born silver foxes appeal so well to Generation Z and millennials.
Yeah, they really do, don't they, Al? Actually,
I don't know.
Not so much. Not so much. Probably
not. I
always
find that I always relate so closely to like the childhood experiences of growing up in the Depression in Utah. Depression era Utah. I mean, it just relates to my daily life as a Gen Xer.
Exactly. Or we'll give you one final choice here, number six. John, is it number six?
After Brigham Young transfigured into Joseph Smith Jr. in August 1844, there is no going back, baby.
No, that's it. That's pretty much it. Okay, so you've got six choices there. Why do you think, John, that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints doesn't have a better prophetic leadership transition process?
I'm going to go back to number one. It's because this whole transition thing that Brigham Young worked out has just been working so well. You can't argue with success.
Yeah, absolutely. So very nice.
Certainly works out for the one who's at the top, right?
Right.
Well, yeah, it does. Yeah. So, thank you very much. Now, the Church, the Community of Christ World Conference, it differs obviously from General Conference in a number of ways, and I believe it only takes place every 3 years. And you're expecting a lot of news to come out. Can you tell us what you're expecting here, John, from the World Conference, which is coming up?
Right. So back in the days of the early church, it was every 6 months, and that was also true at the beginning of the reorganization. But it slowly became annual, and then biennial, and now every 3 years, as you say. And it's because we conduct so much as a conference that it's a lot of work to get delegates from all around the world to come to it, and so forth, and to get legislation prepared. So there's nothing. No overlap anymore between the two traditions. So nothing like happens in the LDS General Conference happens in what we now call World Conference and Community of Christ. So World Conference is a legislature. It's essentially like the Parliament or the World Parliament or the Congress of the Church, and it is essentially the supreme sovereign or body of the Church. It represents the Church, and so the Church is a theodemocracy. It's a democracy where our congregations, like my congregation, elects delegates, which go to the regional conference. The regional conference elects delegates, which are sent to the World Conference. My congregation also, not only has legislation for itself, in other words, its own budget, its own policies and everything, or not policies, but its own priorities, mission priorities, and so forth. We also send and refer legislation that our members write to the regional conference, which, if approved, then can be sent to the World Conference and then can become legislation for the whole church if it becomes a resolution that is enacted by the World Conference. And so essentially we're going to be just looking at all the legislation that everything went through. One of my congregation did send a resolution that's going to be up for consideration, and a bunch of others are up for consideration. The World Conference is also, for example, in charge of the canon of Scripture. So we can add things to the canon and we can take things out. And so one of the things that's before us is, do we want to decanonize a section from the Doctrine and Covenants? One of the mission centers, a regional assembly, has set legislation for us to consider decanonizing a section. And we'll also, of course, I'm sure, be talking about the proposed discernment process that you're talking about with Steve Veazy. In other words, as we are considering as a body, the World Conference, the next calling of the next prophet president. So all of those things will be in front of us. And so I've been elected as one of the delegates, and so I'm going to go to World Conference. And there's several other members of our congregation that are going, and the Canadian Mission Centers where I'm from. And then we'll be joined by delegates from all around the world.
Now, how does the concept of common consent, which of course goes all the way back to the Articles and Covenants of the Church,
right,
which is in our modern day Doctrine and Covenants section 20, and also more elucidated in our Doctrine and Covenants section 26. How does that operate in the community of Christ, and how does that differ from the way it is currently practiced in the LDS Church? Because originally in 1830, the law of common consent, it was only males who were voting, for instance. So how does it work for the community of Christ, and how does it differ from LDS tradition?
Yeah, so all members, so everything is done in the church by common consent. We have the same sections that are the same operative sections in our Doctrine and Covenants as you have in yours, and so we take that very seriously. All of the members of the congregation so you have to be 8 to be a member, but once you are 8 and you're a member, you have voice and vote in a congregation conference, a congregation business meeting. We are legally obliged to have a congregation business meeting. We're a legally incorporated charity in Canada. We have to have one every year. We often have more because we want to consider legislation or programs or anything that anybody wants to have. Essentially, I serve as the pastor of the congregation, but I have not been appointed by some authority above the congregation. The congregation elects the pastor based on who they believe God is calling to be the pastor of the congregation this year, and I also serve essentially at the will of the conference, and so the congregation, the business meeting. So people can demand that we have another business meeting and recall me, essentially, and that works all the way up, right? So like I said, we elect our delegates to the regional conference in Canada, and then send legislation and so forth up to World Conference.
Yeah. And can you put your prophesy hat on? What kind of news do you expect to see from the World Conference? What kind of news are you expecting to see?
I think that there's going to be, now that we have the retirement announcement, I think there's going to be a lot of focus on that and exactly how are we, discerning the way forward. We're trying not to just immediately jump to who's it going to be, kind of thing, but rather, what are the needs and challenges that the church is facing going forward? How can we best respond to that? What are sorts of some of the skill sets? What are that are needed, or what in general, what the direction of the church? So I think that there's going to be a lot of reflection like that, and there's also going to inevitably be some look backs on Steve Veazy's administration, which is not over because it's another 2 years. But anyway, we're going to now be starting to think of those kinds of legacy issues. How has that been defined? You've probably heard about, because we were very transparent in our finances, you probably heard that the community of Christ has had some financial struggles since the last financial meltdown in globally and so on. And so that happened on Steve Veazy's watch, as it were. And we've taken lots of kind of extraordinary measures as a church in order to live within our financial means and get back on track and things like that. And that is also that entire plan is supposed to have been on track to be fixed by this World Conference. And so we'll probably hear, a status on that, which should be pretty good news. And so in other words, that second half of Steve's administration, in a way, brings closure on the first half in that sense. And so then what are we doing going forward, maybe outside of, of crisis? What are some of the missional opportunities that we have in front of us?
Yeah, this is a really interesting process. It does resonate with exactly the way it's laid out in the Doctrine and Covenants. So I'm really impressed by that. The voice of the Lord is heard through the rumblings of the Spirit within each individual member, and then democratically moving its way up into or through the delegates to this to this conference, where the voice of the Lord comes through all the delegates together to come out with what the democratically preferred outcome is. Is that correct?
Yeah, and so we also have to be cautious. That's why we use this word discernment all the time, because democracy can also lead to tyranny, right? And so you can get in a place where there's a popular idea that creates injustice for a minority, and so we do need to be very thoughtful as we are exercising that it's not simply, oh, this is a popular idea that we want to do, but rather everybody needs to take that calling to be individually a prophetic people very, as seriously as, the leaders do,
Yeah, you were talking about financial difficulties within the community of Christ, and I did read that there is a shortfall in your pension for your retiring employees for profits and things like that. I believe it was supposed to be around 125 million, and it's only sitting at like 90 million. There's a small shortfall. Do I have those numbers right?
So I'm not a great numbers guy, so I can't tell you what the numbers are. But yeah, that's the issue. So as of the last financial crisis with the mortgages and everything like that over 10 years ago, there was a shortfall created in the pension plan. They did not want to write down everybody's pensions. So these are folks who devoted their lives to church service. We as a church made a commitment, and so we've been working on, belt tightening and other kinds of ways to raise funds in order to pay that all down. That's been a plan that has been called the Bridge of Hope plan that we've been doing ever since that time, and that is scheduled to be all resolved this year. So I think that we have been on track with that. I don't have the latest details. I'm sure that'll be, again, I actually think it's probably been published, and I haven't looked closely enough recently, but it's supposed to be time for this conference.
Yeah, I believe I read that about 6 months ago when I was looking at some Community of Christ auditing, and I believe that there's that shortfall. But we did buy the Book of Mormon from you for $30 million. I thought that would have helped out. You know what I mean?
It did help out.
$30 million goes a long way, because I thought the Community of Christ operating budget is something like $15 million, right?
Absolutely, it definitely helped out, because ultimately we decided as a church that this particular artifact, while very valuable to us and important to our heritage and so forth, that it was more important to be able to make good on the promise that we'd made to members who would sacrifice their whole lives for this, and that we didn't want to have them lose everything in retirement and so forth, so to pay down their pension.
Now, how much for the Book of Mormon characters document, John? Because that's next up.
Yeah.
That's next up. How much for that one?
I don't know, but actually, I think that the Book of Mormon manuscript sold for much less than it was worth, even though at the time it was the most expensive anybody had paid for any manuscript ever in history. Nonetheless, the way documents are valued, it's based on what the buyers want, and the Mormon documents market is just so crazy, because there's so many ultra rich Mormons, billionaires and so forth, who would really want lots of different documents. So I do think that the document was way undersold. But I nevertheless, I'm also happy that in going to the LDS Church, the Joseph Smith Papers Project has been so good at preserving documents. One of the things that happens when you go to private collectors is that things get off into, you might take a manuscript like that and sell each individual page, because a millionaire will pay, each individual millionaire will pay a lot of money for it. And so it got to be preserved in a way that it can be studied, and everybody can buy a transcript and actually a full facsimile of it now. So it's not like it's hidden in a vault that no one will ever see it. It's in good hands.
Well, not to mention that it will be preserved in the archives, because like the Vatican archives is an excellent example of you have an organization that's so wealthy it can afford to have a vacuumed out room that keeps even air off of these documents, let alone light and all that. Something that a millionaire can't afford to have that kind of a system, regardless. But a multi-billion-dollar corporation for sure can have an archive like that, so they will be preserved for generations to come.
Absolutely.
Now, for those listeners out there, if you find any news articles that you want us to cover in our next podcast, if you come on over to Twitter, you can drop those links to us. We're at News Mormon. Let us know what articles you want us to cover for our next podcast, and we might be able to work them in. Now, John, I'd be remiss if we didn't get your thoughts about the LDS Church and the Ensign Peak Advisors SC Security and Exchange Commission fine, which just took place 2 weeks ago, in which the church was fined $1 million and Ensign Peak Advisors was fined $4 million. Could you give us some of your thoughts on that?
So having read the different articles, and I saw that when it first came out in the Washington Post and so forth, and it does seem like, there was pretty clear wrongdoing, and so the fine is very appropriate, it seems like. So I think that, as I think they indicated, if it was a for-profit corporation or officially for-profit corporation, it would have been fined a lot more. But they've been put on notice for wrongdoing and having done that, and so I think that seems like an appropriate response.
Okay. What do you think has been the reaction to that fine in the greater Community of Christ community?
I think Community of Christ members are very aware that our cousins are like crazy rich. That the Mormon Church has so many oodles of money that we're just, wow, that's amazing. That's not been our experience. Our experience is that we're pretty much always constantly devoting every single thing that we have to mission and stuff, right? And so in my congregation, and one of the things that we did was, we're really concerned about the problem of homelessness and underhousing and housing justice here in the city of Toronto. So 50 years ago, we kind of sacrificed all kinds of stuff in order to start building apartment buildings, or actually taking over decrepit apartment buildings and rehabbing them so that we could house people. Wow. And over the course of 50 years, that charity has amassed enough that, I'm now the president of that charity, and we are kind of trying to break ground this year on a new facility that I'll be able to house another few hundred people, or 200 people anyway. And that's, it'll be like a $60 million facility. So it's way more than what we'd have as a, invested in church stuff, and it's all focused on that kind of missional stuff, Obviously, we'll be mortgaged to the hilt, and we'll be paying that mortgage down for the next 50 years and so forth. But in other words, we want to do these things in order to do mission. That's what, not as opposed to, we have a huge investment portfolio,
So it's kind of like,
you don't just try to bus your homeless people to a different place where they can be somebody else's problem.
No, we house them here in the city, of course, people, we want to be able to have, there's all kinds of where we are right here. So this Center Place, Toronto Center Place, we're right in the heart of downtown. We're 2 blocks from where the first pastor, I'm the 40th pastor of this congregation. The first one was John Taylor, back in 1836. And his house, the cottage meet, was on the same street 2 blocks from here. And so we were right where it all began as a congregation. But all around here, there are shelters, and there are, there's actually the city's drug safe injection site is very nearby. So we're in a place where we can help with that kind of ministry.
You're where the need is. Well done.
Well, it's kind of like what you said, John. Crazy Rich. It's kind of like Crazy Rich Asians. You know that movie? It's Crazy Rich Mormons. The ones in Salt Lake. They're kind of crazy. Now, I read that the Community of Christ has like a $15 million operating budget. I'm not sure. That's probably close, I guess. I'm not sure. But can you discuss how Community of Christ budgeting works, including transparency and auditing?
Yeah. So we're pretty open. We publish all the budgets. We do that also. Legally in Canada, you have to do that anyway. So all churches do that. Even the LDS churches publish its stuff in Canada. But we do that as a congregation. So at every single level, right? So our we have members who are on our audit committee. We have a financial officer who's a member. Everybody, we prepare our own budget as a congregation. It is not like it's all going into one big pool, that Salt Lake or Independence is controlling or something like that. It's held at the congregational level. There's also the same kind of budgeting for the regional, in Canada and so forth, all the way up to the World Conference. All donations, so like when you're giving tithing, you can specify what you want to give to, so there are all kinds of people that donate to Toronto congregation, my congregation, who don't like a lot of religious and church stuff. They like the lectures that we do on the YouTube channel, and they want to support that, and so they can give money in support of that, or however they want it. They're really interested in the mission that we do with the homelessness. So you can put your, direct how your funding is. You can direct it to the congregation level, the regional level. You can direct it to World Church. You can direct it to what you want the World Church to be focusing on, and so forth. And so I don't know, we're pretty transparent about all that, and also allow you to, pick how you're donating and so forth.
Yeah, I would want to put all of my money into I'm a Mormon campaign. No, maybe not. I wouldn't. maybe not. Now, I have a lot of questions for you here, John. What do you think the Brighamite branch can learn from the Prairie Saints with regard to how to utilize the widow's mite? Because the LDS Church has really been in the spotlight recently for what it's done with the widow's mite. Is there any lessons that can be shared from the Prairie Saints to the Brighamite branch?
You should build a lot more temples. I think you don't have very many, and you need more, maybe bigger temples and larger.
Bigger. Wow.
So you're on board with the direction they're going.
Wow, that's surprising. I wasn't expecting that, but okay.
It's like such a staggering amount of money that could be doing all kinds of good things. But what I would do always is like what we try to do with the charity we have here in Toronto, which is exercising good stewardship. So you want to make it so that everything that you're doing is leveraged, and that and it provides a certain amount of good. And so, we're a tiny church, and so we have to, we can't fix the whole homeless problem. What we have to do is we have a very particular niche that we work with. The United Church of Canada has their bigger program and so forth, and we do our part that is, its own little thing that we're specialized at, and we do well. And so with the scale that the money would afford the LDS Church, you could pick some really important problem, whether, just like Bill Gates does, whatever, and whether, eradicate malaria for all of humanity, or, whatever it would be, you could pick something really critically important and really hit that if you wanted to. And so, so that's what I would do. And why wouldn't you want to do that? You get known for that, and people would want to be part of something like that. And it's just sitting there anyway, the money, and you don't even know what to do with it. More temples, or whatever it's going to be. So that you've already got so many, and why not also be known for being the church that got rid of malaria, or whatever, whatever it's going to be, So.
Well, and that generates more interest, as you pointed out, that you get a lot of views, 400,000 views on some of your videos on YouTube, you said. I am curious, John, just numbers-wise, how many members are there of the Community of Christ worldwide?
I was going to make this be my Mormon joke of the week, is that you can't get a straight, or at least a true answer out of any Mormon church about how many members they have. So in the same way that there's 16, however many million members of the LDS Church, and the math really adds up. I'll say we have 250,000 members, and the math adds up just as well.
Okay, very nice. Now, a couple of other things. Has there ever been any financial scandals in like vein in the Community of Christ that are similar to what we've seen in the last couple of weeks?
Well, so there isn't anything in terms of hiding the money like that. Wouldn't it be nice if we had hidden a stash of even a couple $100 million somewhere? That would be nice. I'd like to find that out. No, we don't have anything like that, and so there's been quite good transparency for that. I don't think so. So I'm not aware of any a big scandal about a financial impropriety or anything like that.
Okay. Now let me ask you, when we follow that up, what do you suppose would happen in the Community of Christ if the senior leadership were complicit with 2 decades of investment deception? What would happen?
Well, I would say that so there wasn't any deception, but the financial problem that happened in terms of the pension plan and things like that. So in other words, underfunding in a way the pension or actually taking overspending in terms of out of reserves for operations in the early 2000s, which caused that deficit to happen, or that debt to happen. Wasn't well received by members, right? And so they feel like, the trust for leaders is, to be doing sustainable stewardship. And so one of the results, I think, was that members shifted where donations went. And so people were more confident in let's say, donating to their congregational level, which they can do if they want to send it that way, than they were to world church leaders, which is one of the reasons why the budget, like you say, overall for the world church, which is not the whole church, is simply what the headquarters budget is when you're talking about that number. Why that has gone down so much proportionately to the rest of the budgets that exists for the other components of the church. And so hopefully, having dug out of the hole and maybe it's reestablished trust, that'll be jostled back, going forward.
It's amazing to me what transparency has done to benefit the community of Christ, and how the LDS Church could benefit from that transparency. That in the community of Christ, the funds, the sacred funds that are donated, that widow's mite, is very transparent where it goes and how it's spent. Whereas with the LDS Church, they've been told, well, it goes to build new buildings and to pay for the electricity on those buildings, and et cetera, to build temples, whatnot. And they're just supposed to trust that. But obviously that hasn't been happening. And that's what this SEC fine is about.
Well, and I think at a certain point you also have to, that's just something that all churches also should be rethinking, and the LDS Church should be rethinking too. So how, one of the things that's happened recently in the LDS tradition too is further reduction in how many hours on Sunday or whatever you're going to be doing to church. So any given building, you go to Utah, you just are shocked by just the number of churches there are, and they're all owned by the central corporation and everything like that. And so how much use every day is all of that space, all those square foot, how many hours a week is that in use? And so, I don't know, maybe it is being used all through the whole week and everything like that, but it is a struggle, of whether or not that is even if it is all going to buildings, is buildings an effective use of your tithes? Is that furthering, the real mission of Christ, or is there some other way to be doing it? At a certain point, you're doing things out of a habit, and because that's the way it's always been. And unfortunately, when you don't have, let's say, dynamic leadership that is able to make changes that are not just kind of erratic and quirky, but actually big and structural,
Yeah.
You kind of get stuck into these things.
So impressed that the community of Christ, with its 250,000 members, has housed more homeless people than the LDS Church with 16 million. That just blows my mind.
Well, I don't know how many homeless people you've housed, so I don't know. So
none.
That's not a function that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a part of, really.
It isn't, and they've said as much.
Yeah. And that's why I wanted to ask you, John, regarding Joseph Smith's religion and legacy. We have the church headquartered in Salt Lake City. We have the church headquartered in Independence, Missouri. How did these religions become so vastly different in how they approach mission, secrecy, finances, and transparency? Because we're both coming out of the same tradition. So how did they become they're polar opposites?
Well, my understanding of the LDS kind of more secrecy development is, so a lot of times what happens in the LDS tradition is you kind of look back and you say, every single thing that's different from our church in Community of Christ, it means the Community of Christ has changed, and we're doing things the way they've always been. But actually, the LDS church is a living tradition which does change over time, and so, for example, LDS practice of having a bishop be the leader of a ward, as it's called, this is a Utah development, and so this is not what the early church was like. Early churches, like, the branch president is also usually called a pastor. So John Taylor, who went on to be a Brighamite president and so forth, he was pastor of this congregation when he was here. And so in that same sense, the transparency, my understanding is that it happened in the 1960s. The LDS church had been, let's say, operated way more vernacularly, which is to say people who were just not, they were businessmen, but not like maybe business school businessmen and so forth. And so the church was in financial, on the balance books, looked like it was not doing well. This Wilkinson era, as it were, of like buying lots and lots of buildings, and if you build them, they will come. It was a strategy that worked and actually fueled a lot of growth in the 1960s and the Cultural Revolution, and most specifically the counter to the counterculture. So people who were opposed to, let's say, liberalization of the crazy 60s flocked into the LDS church at that time in the United States. But things looked really bad. And so the balance sheets were looking like the church was going bankrupt and things like that in the LDS church in the 1960s. And so they stopped reporting everything. But actually, it wasn't really going that bad. There was huge amounts of assets. There was all kinds of potential. They called in some big New York bankers. They told them how to restructure everything and put things into investment accounts and everything like that. And all these decades later, the $100 billion or whatever. So it was not a problem. But they just, once they went to secrecy, they just never went back. And that's just a development in the LDS Church because of a time period when the books weren't looking good, so they stopped showing them to people.
Yeah, and I also think that everything really relates back to polygamy as well. When you embrace polygamy, which by its nature of being against the law, it needs to be very secretive. It really breeds a secretive environment, not just in polygamy, but in other things, and also the embracing of the current, the temple rituals. The temple rituals are shrouded in secrecy, and there's oaths to protect those. And because the RLDS tradition didn't participate in the polygamy, didn't participate in the temple rituals in the same way, the seeds of secrecy were never really, they just never really took hold. That's just
insight. Yes.
Yeah, I've got a lot of questions for you. I don't know if we're going to get to all of them because I don't want to hold you too long. But let me ask you this next question. The LDS Church, it owns Bonneville Communications, which has broadcasting journalistic capabilities. The church owns the Church News, the Deseret News, KSL, thousands of radio affiliates across the nation. Now, does the Community of Christ generate news in a similar manner? As a propaganda, because it's really the church's journalistic arm is really a propaganda arm of the church. It does not report negative or unflattering news. Does the Community of Christ do that in a similar way? And also a two-parter, if I wanted to follow news pertaining to the Community of Christ, what resources would you recommend?
Yeah. So it's complicated, but yeah, I would say that in some points there's some similarities. So the church grew out of the same source. And the church was in the early years was very much a communications pioneer. It was dependent on the fact that there were newspapers. So one of the very first things that the church did after it was organized was that it opened the Evening and the Morning Star in Independence, Missouri, in 1831 or whatever it was, 1830, 1831, and that was the furthest west newspaper at the time, right? And so it was on the American frontier. And so that was central to, that kind of communication was central to what the church was. And so for the moment when the Brighamite church under Brigham Young, when they abandon Nauvoo and are on this middle of this trek, and their rivals, like James Strang at his headquarters in Wisconsin, James Strang for a time is the only, one of the only, LDS church organizations or headquarters that actually has a newspaper, because while they're in trekking, I guess there's a newspaper maybe in England or something like that, but the LDS church doesn't have a local newspaper, and it was a problem communications-wise. And so in the same way, the reorganization since 1860 has had our periodical, the Herald, we call it. It used to be originally called the True Latter-day Saints Herald, as opposed to which non-true Latter-day Saints, right? You can tell it began as a polemic, right? And so that's the longest, I think, continuously running, Latter-day Saint publication. It continues to be essential to Community Christ communications. So that has gone through all kinds of different evolution, though, over the course of its time. So at a certain point, it was kind of way more of an open forum where RLDS members debated each other all the time. So it was always edited by like Joseph III or whatever. It's always under the editorial control of the First Presidency, but there was a lot of room for oppositional views. That kind of got pared down in the 1960s when debates got really heated, And so what I would say now is the Herald is very much kind of a international headquarters propaganda, you're calling it, right? So in other words, it's representing the perspective of what headquarters wants to say, and not as much the other views and that kind of a thing.
Kind of like a newsletter.
It's more like an in-house periodical corporate magazine. In other words,
that makes sense.
This is what, and so in the 80s, corporate communications, what communications is, that kind of took hold, that kind of communications model, and you don't want to have any bad press, and you want to have a communications team, and Community Christ is a lot like that, and so it definitely absorbed all of those kinds of like lessons of business that kind of a thing. Not doing a great job at it, but compared to it, because we're such a smaller organization compared to the LDS Church, but doing that kind of a thing. We were innovators and pioneers very early on. So in terms of other communications, we had a radio station, I think the first church-owned radio station in the United States called KLDS. And I think that had a significant impact on the Kansas City market. You go to Kansas City today, and half the radio stations are owned by churches. And I think that it's like a bunch of evangelicals who bought radio stations to counter this, renegade Mormon radio station that they were very offended by, presumably. So that was very early on. But no, we don't have anything that is like Bonneville Communications that's producing this level of anything. And unfortunately, I would say, and so we did have another arm that was the publications arm, so like the Deseret book kind of thing, and Community of Christ people throughout the 20th century just produced a crazy number of books and bought a crazy number of books comparative to their numbers, and so that was definitely central to the culture. But that's wound down a lot in the 21st century, and so now I would say that overall we have a lot less going for us in terms of communication. So I don't think the headquarters has adapted well to the new paradigm. They have their own YouTube channel, things like that. I'll just say, my congregation's YouTube channel actually has 10 times the subscribers as the headquarters, and also 10 times the views. So it is kind of, so we're sort of in a place where the church needs to work on that more, at least headquarters needs to work on that more, I'd say.
Okay.
Now, I have another follow-up with that goes with what we were talking about earlier. What do you suppose that the Community of Christ would do with the approximately $150 billion currently being invested in Ensign Peak? That's part one. What do you think the church would do with it? And number two, if you were the head of Community of Christ, what would you, and you had access to that fund, what would you personally do with it?
I mean, like I even kind of mentioned it, which is to say we would want to do is a discernment process as a church. What is the way we could make the most effective use of missional funds like that sustainably? So how could we leverage that to have the biggest positive impact planet-wide? And it would happen in a way that is very, very progressive. So in other words, because we would be looking at a thing where there's all kinds of other charities and even churches like the Catholic Church, which are really big, but can't do extremely progressive things because they have a bigger base. And so we'd come up with something like that.
It's
Wow.
amazing to me how collaborative you are with your answers, because notice the way that I phrased it is a very Brighamite branch. What would you do with it? Because it's always from the top down. You didn't even engage with that because the Community of Christ, it's a community. You said we would need to come together to make these decisions.
Yeah.
So
well, if I was the president, even if I was the president of the church, it wouldn't be my decision to do with it. Right. What is the church? How is God calling the church to make the world a better place? Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You guys really live up to your name, the Community of
Right.
Christ.
Yeah, I'm starting to get that. Now, a lot of Mormons in Utah are calling for the Common Council of the Church for this deception which took place. And I just wanted to ask you, has the Community of Christ ever used the Common Council of the Church ever since Sidney Rigdon was excommunicated back in end of 1844? Has it ever been used in the Community of Christ?
No. So I don't think so. So we continue to have what I would call at the time period in Nauvoo, which would have been called the presiding high council or the standing high council of the church, and that continues to be let's say a body that deals with kind of legal stuff. We don't actually do a lot of excommunicating. That's not. I actually, as a pastor, so I've been pastor for 9 years of this congregation, and I've had to ask my field apostle a couple times if we were going to have a excommunication, how would we do that? It's pretty theoretical from my perspective. Essentially, the main kind of disciplining that happens would be. So you don't have to be in priesthood in Community of Christ. So there's an automatic priesthood for men in the LDS Church. And Community of Christ it involves like a lot more. It's a long process. It involves taking courses and getting certifications and things like that, like youth worker training and all the other kinds of things. And so a person can be relieved, as a disciplinary thing. A person can be relieved of priesthood status, but to be actually excommunicated would, I don't know, they'd have to have done something. I don't know what, So, I mean, there was a schism, in the 80s, and so there was a lot more of that going on when there was a big fight over, women's ordination, that kind of a thing. But in the modern church or the contemporary church now, it's more theoretical kind of thing.
All right. Hey, thank you so much, John, for sharing everything with us. And this has just been so fascinating for me, and I'm sure our listeners appreciate you as well. Okay, so we're going over to thechurchnews.com, where Scott Taylor has written an article under Living Faith, and it's titled, Why Dying Testimonies is Just One Reason to Avoid Missionary Slang. So I'm sure that anybody that's served as a full-time missionary for the church has been through several conferences or zone conferences and mission meetings where they've been told, hey, knock it off with the slang and stop saying certain things. Don't refer to the mission president as Prez. That's seems to be kind of the go-to, right?
So it's funny. He talked about dying testimonies. Now, it took me a while. I had to read this article 2 times before I realized what a dying testimony is. A dying testimony in the LDS tradition is the last testimony that a missionary gives before he leaves the mission field and then goes back home. That's called that's a dying testimony. I wasn't aware of that one. That wasn't back in my day. We didn't have dying testimonies, okay? But it talks a lot about the slang. We shouldn't use those kind of slang words. We shouldn't call anybody greenies anymore. We can't. And also, this was one that President Nelson brought forward. He said, we don't call people investigators anymore. They're now called friends. Okay, I'm having a hard time. I guess I'm just old school, but I'm having a hard time with some of these. I'm having a hard time with some of this stuff. That's all I'm saying. You know what I mean?
Oh, that's a little creepy to just refer to people there looking into the church and that are meeting with missionaries to refer to them as friends.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, but then again, this is just a more evolution of the language and the culture. Because investigators is that was the official term for decades.
Yeah, it was. Now, if you look at the reception, because the Church News posts it not only on the church's website, but they also put it out on their official Twitter feed, and that's where you get a lot of the reactions here. And there's a lot of people are very, very critical on this one. I pulled out a few comments here, and it said, "Dear Church News, there are much, much bigger issues happening in the mission field that need to be addressed than using the word greenie." And another comment here is. Quote, things to avoid. Number 1, absconding $32 billion, end quote. So this SEC thing is people are going to be using that to beat the church up for years. Another one here, I got a couple of other ones here. Quote, I read the article, but I still don't understand what is meant by dying testimony, end quote. I had to read the article twice to figure that out.
Yeah.
This is, I also find this to be very ironic because the last week we covered in our last episode that we're on the heels where a missionary in Colombia was seriously stabbed and in a coma and almost had to have a limb amputated. And also the same week we had 4 sister missionaries in South America as well, I believe, who were assaulted and at least one of them raped. Okay, but the church's response isn't, hey, we're going to have different protocols, or hey, we're going to stand down, do different safety measures, we're going to increase something. Instead, the article's point here is that we are to avoid missionary slang, and I just find that to be very ironic. I'll just put it that way.
Tone deaf, isn't it? With all that's going on, the big problem that the church feels the need to address in their published newspaper is the language that missionaries are using to refer to when they're going home and when they're new in the mission field.
Right. Yeah, this on the heels from the SEC as well. So we got that. It's just I think the timing on this is pretty poor. Now, real quick, our next couple of articles here. We only have 2 last articles to get through, and this is an interesting article here that was published by our favorite researcher here, Ryan Burge. And Ryan Burge put out a chart where in Mormon land, which is a comparison of educational attainment in the U.S. broken down by religion and denomination. So he's talking about Reformed Jews, conservative Jews, atheists, Episcopalians, agnostic, Orthodox, Buddhists. He ranks all of them at the educational level. Now, John, unfortunately, the Community of Christ didn't rise to the level on this particular one. But Mormons in general, I was surprised about this. Al, where do Mormons rank as far as educational level when ranked with all other religions, including atheists and agnostics, at least in the United States? Where I know this isn't in Canada, John, but it is in the United States. Where are Mormons ranking here, Al?
Smack dab in the middle. They're not high. They're not low. They're not dumb. They're not smart.
Yeah, they're surprisingly average.
Yeah.
Now, and there's a stereotype that says that Mormons are really, really well educated, that they're smart, and I think that there's a lot to be saying for that. But there's an issue here. The reason that Mormons don't rank higher is because a lot of women in the church. They are, they're set to, they stay at home. The messaging is stay at home. You're supposed to raise kids. You don't need to have an education. Now, I know that, it's not as bad as it once was, but because, female women empowerment in the church is so low that, they don't attain, they don't have ordained office. They don't lead in the church in any meaningful way. And a lot of them are expected to, a lot of women are taught that you're supposed to stay at home and raise children. That means that a lot of Mormon women don't have a high educational level because they have children early. and often they don't finish that educational level. And I think that's a reason that Mormons are very, very smack dab in the middle. Any thoughts on this article here, John?
Yeah, so obviously we come out of the same tradition in the reorganization as in the LDS Church, and we've also kept that focus. And so, for example, from where Joseph Smith was, he as a had a vernacular education and so forth, not as uneducated as he sometimes portrayed, but anyways, a person who was interested in learning but didn't have and continued to be involved in kind of lifelong learning as he was trying to do that. From kind of those kind of aspirational levels, his grandson, the third prophet of Community of Christ, Frederick Madison Smith, got a PhD in sociology in like 1905 or something like that. So in other words, it was already very early on, very rare to PhDs back then, that kind of focus. And he was also the first undergraduate to get a degree from Community of Christ University, Graceland University back then a college, but anyway, in Iowa, in Lamoni, Iowa. And I guess I would say is that, one of our mission initiatives as a church, so we have like a fivefold mission of the church, and one of those is develop disciples to serve. So continually learning and growing is something that we're all supposed to be doing at all times. And I know from my own experience, I got in my congregation, which is pretty, not that huge, but anyway, in terms of official members, there's lots of people have graduate degrees and even PhDs and things like that. So I know that there is a big focus on ongoing education in our side anyway, and for women too.
It appears, John, that you're flexing on us with your Canadian intelligence and bona fides up there versus us pedestrian Americans. Am I getting the gist of that? Just kidding. It appears, this is my summary here. The glory of God is intelligence, but Latter-day Saints are pathetically average when it comes to educational levels. Okay. Now, our last article here, which I just found this today, and this is really amazing to me. This is absolutely incredible here. So this is an article here which was dropped on LDSliving.com. This was by Morgan Pearson, March 9, 2023. Why an Anglican priest now lives the word of wisdom and feels it a privilege to pay tithing. So, you heard that right. So Reverend Andrew Teal has a deep love and admiration for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He recently gave an astounding Brigham Young University address in 2021. He's attended General Conference, and he's currently working in collaboration with BYU to create a Center of Faith and Reconciliation. So Teal here, he is taking on the most difficult aspects of Mormon culture and teachings just for fun. He's not doing it. He said he's not getting baptized. He's just doing the tough parts of Mormonism just for fun. Now, regarding the word of wisdom, Al, here's what he, can you read that section about what he said about living the word of wisdom?
Yeah. Okay. So he says, quote, I thought I want to keep the word of wisdom because these promises actually signify something.
Now, how do you feel about someone who's not a member of the church, Al, living the word of wisdom just for the spiritual aspects of it? What do you think?
I've got a big problem with this quote. I don't think he understands the word of wisdom at all. I think he's looking at this as a promise that we make to the Lord that we're going to abstain from certain things in our diet, and we're not going to drink certain things or partake of certain substances. But that's not how it's written in the Doctrine and Covenants. It's given as kind of a advice that you should follow, and if you do follow it, you're given a promise that you'll have good health and long life, etc. But
there's a promise at the end. It says, "All saints who keep and do these things will have health in the navel, marrow, and the bones, and will walk and not be weary, and shall run and not faint." Yeah, there's promises. It's a promise.
So there's a promise that's coming that way if you do it. But I don't know that is this a promise that we make, or a promise that's given to us in return if we'll do these things? I'm a little confused by that.
I would think by what he's saying, he's taking this as a divine promise, right? I mean, I would imagine. But like you point out, there's a big divergence between the word of wisdom as written as text and contemporary LDS practice, which involves
very true
caffeinated pop or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, which is it's the part of the word of wisdom. A lot of folks here in Community of Christ in Canada talk about, because there's a bunch of folks who are on promoting this plant-based diet, and I don't know how many Mormons don't eat meat in the wintertime or whatever it says in the word of wisdom in that way.
Yeah,
we
only
take it in our church as by way of, not by way of commandment or constraint. Here's a word of wisdom, and everyone's free to interpret it and as they like. Therefore, so.
Yeah, eat meat sparingly, only in times of famine. I wonder if Reverend Andrew Teal is still eating fruit out of season, which is also the Word of Wisdom takes a dim view of as well. So it's amazing.
Well, you're also supposed to make your own communion wine, and I wonder if he does that.
He seems like I've heard of cafeteria Mormonism, but I haven't heard of cafeteria Anglicanism. I'm not that familiar with it. I don't know that much about it. But it's not just the Word of Wisdom, which is a real stumbling block for a lot of people. Mormons get a lot of grief for the Word of Wisdom, especially the coffee, the prohibition against the modern church's interpretation of the prohibition against coffee. But it's not just the Word of Wisdom. Okay, he's paying tithing. Okay, he's paying tithing to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now, I've got this quote here, Al, and I just find this to be absolutely amazing, especially on the heels of what we found out about what happens with the tithing in the last couple of weeks. It wasn't quite the rosy picture that we were all hoping for, but that doesn't seem to bother Andrew Teal. Do you have that next section about why he's paying tithing to the church?
Oh, absolutely. I can't wait to read this. Okay, so the quote says, "This sounds very much like propaganda, as if I've been paid to say this by the 12. But to be able to tithe, to be able for me as a non-member of the church to say, I want to contribute to the mission and ministry of the church in the world because I trust this community. I trust it to be able to act on my behalf, to give back to God, and to give to His children what they need in terms of temples, in terms of missionaries, in terms of education, whatever. I think that's a tremendous honor to be allowed to be a part of that," Teal said.
Okay, Al, what is your reaction to him paying tithing?
My goodness. Okay, it's very evident to me. So the way that Reverend Teal got introduced to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was through a senior couple missionary, Matthew Holland, who is the son of Jeffrey R. Holland, and the current city apostle. Matthew Holland was a senior missionary, former president of University of Utah. Or sorry, the UVU, Utah Valley
University. Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And he was serving as a senior couple missionary, knocked on this reverend's door in Oxford University, England, and said, hey, let's be friends. And so they got to know each other's religions a little bit. And then Matthew said, oh, you really need to meet my dad. So he introduced him to Jeffrey R. Holland, and they've become good friends. And he's definitely been talking to Jeffrey R. Holland and getting a lot of great advice about, that if you give your money to the church, this is what we're going to do with it. And this is how these things help the world. Because he's so proud to contribute to temples. Does he have any idea what goes on inside the temples? How could he?
Not sure. Don't know. John, how do you feel about Reverend Andrew Teal paying tithing to the church?
Well, I unfortunately don't. I oppose paying tithing to the LDS Church because the LDS Church engages in political activity trying to suppress human rights around the world. So it is a very effective and persistent political enemy of civil and human rights in the United States and abroad and so forth. And so I think that people should give their money to other charities that are actually doing charitable work and avoid that kind of those kind of payments. But I don't know, man. I have no idea what the reverend's. He may well be, opposed to LGBT and other human rights himself. So it might well be, no big deal to him. I don't know.
Well, I'll tell you, John, just based off of our conversation with you today, I would much rather go and grab Reverend Teal and point him towards the community of Christ and say, pay your tithing to these people and you'll see the good that can be done with your money in the world, rather than throwing it to a multi-billion-dollar corporation that's being fined by the SEC for a lack of compliance.
Yeah, and by the way, who is going to be the first person to tell Reverend Teal about Ensign Peak? You know what I mean? I refuse to do it. It's not going to be me. I'm not going to spoil. I don't want to spoil his beautiful fantasy. You know what I mean? I'm not going to be that guy. I'm not going to fall on that sword. This is one heck of an article. I've never heard of anything like this. Are there any Community of Christ members who pay tithing to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that you've ever heard of, John?
Well, so we believe in dual citizenship, so you can be a member of Community of Christ in the LDS Church. So yes, so there are people who, you can't tell the LDS Church that, because they have dual citizenship.
Right.
We're totally fine with dual citizenship. And so, there are members who are members of both churches who pay tithing to the LDS Church in some cases. That's the personal decision. That's fine.
Okay, well, good on them. Now, we have some huge shows and guests coming up here. We have the world premiere of Sophronia, our General Authority Patreon and supporter and special guest host next week. We have Jonathan Streeter from Thoughts and Things and Stuff later this month. And we have Jane Christie from 21st Century Saints, who's on deck. Now, John, what projects are you currently working on, and how can people get in touch with you?
So there's a couple things. So like I say, I'm actually leading the Community of Christ's largest online global ministry, which is online every Sunday at noon Eastern, 10 a.m. Mountain. You can go to our website to get linked up to it. Our website is centerplace.ca. So Canada is .ca, but anyway, center spelled the Canadian way, so with R-E at the end.
They are before the E.
They are before the E at the end of that. And so we invite you to come and see what a very progressive, non-creedal church where we don't focus on or even, let's say, believe in historicity of the scripture stories and things like that, but instead are looking for a living tradition and how we can help the world today, but make everything more Zion-like if we can. And my other major project is every Tuesday night at 7 Eastern. These are recorded, so you can watch anytime, but 7 Eastern, 5 Mountain. On Tuesdays, I will give a lecture on some topic related to history, theology, or philosophy. And so those are on a wide variety of topics, including restoration, tradition stuff. And so I talk about Book of Mormon authorship or history of Community of Christ, the succession crisis, but I also talk about biblical studies. I recently did one on biblical matriarchs. Why are the matriarchs in the Genesis story and so forth always beating out the patriarchs who seem like dunderheads, even though it's like a very patriarchal society that's described, that kind of a thing. So if you're interested in any of these kind of topics, you can find us that way. And so through our YouTube channel and also our Centerplace website.
Yeah, we are going to link to your YouTube channel in the show notes. So to our listeners out there, if you're curious about this video that has 400,000 views on YouTube, follow the link on YouTube or to the YouTube channel in our show notes, and you can go take a look and see what it's all about. So thank you again, John. It's been a real treasure to have you here and a real treat, especially for our number 50 episode. This was the perfect episode to mark number 50 for us. So thank you again for joining us today.
Well, you're very welcome. It was a delight to be here, and I've really enjoyed this conversation, and thanks so much to your listeners.
Yep, and thanks again, D-Vase. We had a great time with you today as well. We'll give a shout-out to Weird Alma for this episode and every episode's music. Thanks so much for ruminating with us on the great and spacious beehive, and remember, no one hallowed hand can stop this podcast from progressing. A big thank you to our sponsor, Signature Books, for supporting us here at the Mormon News Roundup. Please go over to signaturebooks.com and check out some of the latest publications that they have. Currently, they have things like Lighthouse, the Gerald and Sandra Tanner story by Ronald V. Huggins, one of the stories about the two most famous critics of Mormonism today. We've also got the story of Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon, a biography, suffragist, senator, and plural wife. That one is by Constance Lieber. And then we've also got a really good one here called DNA Mormon by Benjamin E. Park. So for all of your interest in Mormon studies and research, go over to signaturebooks.com and support our sponsor. Thank you.
When it comes to nicknames of the church, such as LDS Church, the Mormon Church, to remove the Lord's name from the Lord's church is a major victory for Satan.
Satan.
Please allow me to introduce myself. I'm a being with no moral constraints. My number one goal is to hurt the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.